History is filled with stories that seem almost too extraordinary to believe. Stories that blur the lines between documented fact, criminal investigation, political controversy, and public mythology. Some eventually become accepted history after years of skepticism, while others remain unresolved decades later, leaving behind unanswered questions that deeply divided opinions. Among the most controversial American scandals of the 20th century is what has come to be known as the Franklin Scandal, a case that began with allegations of financial fraud in Nebraska but gradually expanded into claims of political corruption, child abuse, witness intimidation, and an alleged cover up that continues to generate debate. To understand why the Franklin scandal remains one of America's most disputed stories, we must carefully separate documented facts from allegation. Examine the evidence cited by supporters and review the conclusions reached by official investigations, and acknowledge where uncertainty still exists. The story does not begin with secret societies or sensational accusations. It begins with money, banking, politics, and power in Omaha, Nebraska during the 1980s. The Franklin Community, the federal credit union, was originally established to provide financial services for lower income residents, offering loans and banking opportunities to communities that often struggled to obtain traditional financial assistance. Over time, however, the institutions became closely associated with an ambitious and politically connected figure named Lawrence E. King Jr., whose influence would eventually place the credit union at the center of one of the most controversial investigations in modern American history. Lawrence King cultivated an image of success, philanthropy, and political influence. He became active in Republican political circles, attended high-profile fundraising events, appeared alongside influential public officials, and developed relationships that projected an image of national importance beyond Nebraska itself. Photographs of King with politicians and prominent figures would later become central to public discussions, not because of the photographs proved any criminal conduct, but because the supporters of later allegations argued they demonstrated King's unusually extensive political access. Critics, however, counted that politicians routinely appeared with donors and community leaders, and that such photographs alone established nothing about the criminal activity. By the mid-1980s, the financial questions surrounding the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union began attracting increasing scrutiny. The examiners identified irregularities involving loans, accounting practices, and missing funds that suggested that the institutions was experiencing several financial problems. The investigators eventually concluded that millions of dollars had disappeared from the credit union, making its collapse one of Nebraska's largest financial scandals at the time. These financial findings are not disputed, and the existence of major fraud within the institution was well documented, and it ultimately led to criminal prosecutions related to financial crimes. The collapse of the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union had devastating consequences for depositors, and the taxpayers. The federal regulators stopped in as investigators attempted to determine how significant the losses were without earlier intervention. The questions emerged regarding oversight, internal controls, and whether warning signs had been ignored by the regulators or concealed by the individuals within the institution. At this stage, the scandal remained primarily a story about financial corruption rather than the broader allegations that would later dominate public attention. Lawrence King had eventually fled the United States before legal proceedings concluded. He was later arrested in another country, returned to face charges, and ultimately pled guilty to multiple counts involving financial fraud, King was sentenced to federal prison for embezzlement and related financial offenses connected to the collapse of the credit union. Now, these convictions are documented facts and form the undisputed foundations of the Franklin case, regardless of later controversies. Now, if the story had ended there, the Franklin scandal might be remembered today primarily as another case of financial corruption during the savings and loan era. But instead, entirely different allegations soon emerged that transformed the investigation into something far more controversial. These allegations did not involve accounting records or loan documents, but claims of organized child sexual abuse involving politically connected individuals. It is at this point that the story becomes significantly more complex, more disputed, and far more difficult to evaluate. And I want you guys to keep this in mind as well as far as you look at today's day and age with the Epstein files, and we're all being ran by pedophiles more or less in our government. Moving on, several young people had connected to the Nebraska foster care system began making allegations that reached far beyond the financial fraud. They had described being transported to parties where they claimed powerful adults sexually abused them. Some had alleged they were flown to locations outside of Nebraska, including Washington, D.C., where they claimed additional abuse occurred involving influential individuals. These allegations were extraordinary, serious, but all the allegations alone are not proof, and the investigators faced the difficult task of determining whether independent evidence could corroborate the claims. Among the individuals whose testimonies became central to the public discussion was Paul Bonacci. Bonacci alleged that he had been abused as a child and that he had participated in transporting other children to parties involving prominent individuals. He had later provided detailed statements describing the locations, transportation methods, names of the participants, and the alleged criminal conduct spanning several years. Supporters of the Franklin allegation had argued that Bonacci consistently maintained key elements of his account despite the intense scrutiny, while critics note that the consistencies alone cannot establish factual accuracy. I know I probably butchered the Bonacci name. I done the best I could. I apologize for that. Another major figure was Alicia Owen, whose testimony had also become widely discussed during the subsequent investigations. Owens alleged she had been abused and identified Lawrence King as one of the perpetrators. She had further claimed that politically connected individuals participated on a facilitated abuse, and that powerful people sought to suppress the truth. Like Bonacci statements, Owens' allegations would later become the subject of extensive legal examination and public controversy. As additional witnesses emerged, investigators attempted to determine whether the independent evidence had supported the allegations. Some of the witnesses described airplanes, hotels, residences, and gatherings involving individuals in positions of authority. Others had claimed they had personally witnessed the abuse or participated under coercion. The growing number of allegations attracted increasing media attention, although the national coverage remained relatively limited compared to the extraordinary nature of the claims. Journalist Gary Cardori entered the story as an investigator working on the Nebraska Legislative Franklin Committee. Cardori was tasked with examining the allegations, interviewing witnesses, and determining whether the evidence existed to support the claims extending beyond the financial misconduct. He became convinced that at least some witnesses deserved serious consideration and had reportedly believed the additional evidence might substantiate aspects of their accounts. His work would later become one of the most frequently discussed chapters in the Franklin narrative. Cardori traveled extensively while interviewing witnesses and collecting documents. According to colleagues and family members, he believed he was making a significant progress and had acquired information that could alter the public's understanding of the case. There were reports circulated that he had obtained photographs and additional materials shortly before returning to Nebraska. What happened next would permanently shape the perceptions of the Franklin scandal. On July 11, 1990, Gary Cardori and his young son died when their private aircraft crashed near Aurora, Illinois. Federal investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the crash resulted from an in-flight structural failure, determining that the aircraft broke apart before the impact due to mechanical circumstances rather than sabotage. Official investigations found no evidence supporting the claims that the aircraft had been intentionally destroyed. Nevertheless, because Cardori has been investigating politically explosive allegations, his death immediately generated speculation that continues decades later. The supporters of the Franklin conspiracy allegations argue that important evidence had allegedly been being transported by Cardori disappeared following the crash. They cite reports that the briefcases or pornographic materials were never recovered and point to witness statements suggesting Cardori believed he possessed highly significant evidence. Skeptics respond that stories about missing evidence remain unverified and that the official investigations found no credible evidence linking the crash to criminal interference. The disagreement over Cardori's death remains one of the defining controversies surrounding the Franklin scandal. While Cardori's investigation ended tragically, the legal proceedings regarding the witness allegations continued. A special grand jury was convened in Nebraska to evaluate the testimony and available evidence. Grand juries operate differently from criminal trials in reviewing evidence to determine whether probable cause exists for indictments rather than deciding guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. After reviewing the testimony, the grand jury had reached conclusions that dramatically shaped the future of the case. Rather than issuing indictments against Lawrence King or other alleged participants based on the abuse allegations, the grand jury conceded that the accusations constituted what it described as carefully fabricated hoax. Investigators stated they found insufficient credible evidence supporting the allegations and had identified numerous inconsistencies among witness accounts. Some witnesses were accused of providing false testimony under oath, and these official findings became the basis for later prosecutions involving perjury rather than abuse charges. Alicia Owen was convicted of multiple counts of perjury after the authorities concluded she knowingly provided false testimony to the grand jury. She served prison time as a result of those convictions, and supporters argue her persecution discouraged other alleged victims from coming forward. While the critics maintain that knowingly false testimony undermines legitimate investigations and must carry legal consequences, Owens had continued maintaining that her original allegations were truthful despite the legal findings against her. Other witnesses also had faced credibility challenges during the official investigations. The prosecutors had highlighted inconsistencies, changing accounts, contradictions, and the absence of physical evidence, corroborating many of the most serious allegations. Defense advocates argued that trauma can affect the memory, that abused children often provide fragmented accounts, and that inconsistencies do not necessarily prove fabrication. This debate over witness credibility remains central to differing interpretations of the Franklin scandal today. Another frequently discussed aspect involves the allegations of the witness intimidation. The supporters claim several witnesses reported threats of harassment or pressure intended to discourage cooperation with investigators. They had argued such claims help explain inconsistencies and reluctance among the alleged victims. Official investigations, however, generally concluded that available evidence did not establish a coordinated campaign that was capable of substantiating broader conspiracy allegations. The media coverage of the Franklin scandal varied dramatically depending on the publication and time period. Local Nebraska newspapers extensively covered the financial fraud investigation while approaching the abuse allegations with greater caution. National outlets generally devoted their limited sustained attention compared with the enormous public interest generated years later through the books, documentaries, and independent investigations. This relatively lack of mainstream coverage has itself become part of the controversy, with the supporters interpreting it as evidence of institutional reluctance and skeptics viewing it as a reflection of insufficient corroborating evidence. One of the publications that had significantly influenced public perception was the Franklin Cover-Up, written by former Nebraska State Senator John DeCamp. DeCamp argued that the powerful individuals had obstructed legitimate investigations and that the evidence supported many of the allegations made by witnesses. His book became enormously influential among the researchers interested in government misconduct, institutional corruption, and historical cover-ups. The critics, however, argued that the book relied heavily on contested testimony and speculative conclusions that exceeded what available evidence should firmly establish. Also, the documentary Conspiracy of Silence further expanded the public's awareness of the Franklin allegations. Produced in the 1990s, the documentary reportedly examined claims involving abuse, political influence, and alleged institutional obstruction. It has often been claimed that the documentary was scheduled for broadcast before being withdrawn, fueling speculation about the censorship. However, the explanations for its cancellation have varied, with some citing legal concerns and questions regarding the evidentiary standards rather than the proof of a coordinated suppression effort. As interest grew, the comparisons inevitably emerged between the Franklin allegations and later the scandals involving powerful individuals accused of exploiting children. Years after Franklin first entered the public consciousness, revelations surrounding the case involving figures such as Jeffrey Epstein caused many observers to revisit the earlier allegations with renewed attention. The supporters had argued that history demonstrates powerful offenders can evade the accountability for years, suggesting Franklin deserves renewed examination. The skeptics cautioned against assuming similarities between the unrelated cases established the truth of disputed historical allegations. One of the enduring challenges in evaluating Franklin lies in the distinguishing possibility from proof. History contains documented examples of institutional failures. Official corruption and criminal conspiracies once dismissed as implausible before being later being confirmed. At the same time, however, history also contains moral panic, false accusations, unreliable testimony, and conspiracy theories that collapsed under careful investigation. Responsible historical analysis requires a recognition of both realities simultaneously rather than embracing certainty unsupported by evidence. By the early 1990s, the official legal proceedings concerning Franklin had largely concluded. Lawrence King remained in prison for financial crimes but was never convicted of crimes related to the abuse allegations. The grand jury findings continued to characterize the broader allegations as unsubstantiated, while several witnesses maintained for decades that they had told the truth despite legal consequences. The divide between official conclusions and continuing public skepticism had become a defining feature of the Franklin scandal legacy. And even today, the researchers examining the Franklin scandal often arrive at a sharply different conclusion despite reviewing many of the same documents. Some view the case as the evidence of institutional protection for powerful individuals, while arguing that the investigative failures prevented accountability. Others had concluded that while the financial crimes were unquestionably real, the more expansive allegations had failed to meet evidentiary standards necessary for criminal prosecution, and it remained unsupported by a sufficiently reliable corroboration between these positions, which lies a complex historical record filled with incomplete documentation, as well as conflicting testimony and unanswered questions and enduring controversy. Now, as part one comes to a close, the Franklin scandal remains suspended between established fact and unresolved allegations. The financial fraud is documented history, the witnesses' testimony exists in official records, and the grand jury reached definitive conclusions. And yet, public debate has never fully subsided because many of the questions continue to linger in the minds of researchers, journalists, former investigators, and observers. In part two, we will examine the later investigations, civil litigation, psychological debates surrounding witness testimony, and the influence of the Franklin scandal on later discussions of organized abuse allegations, comparisons with subsequent high-profile cases, newly available records, and why this controversial chapter continues to shape conversations about the power, accountability, institutional trust, and the difficult search for historical truths, decades after the events themselves. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you in part two. Peace.